So yeah, as I said in the setup, I've worked in the for-purpose sector, as you call it, in Australia for all my career. I've gone through several mergers over the last few years, and can really see the need to provide some incentive or some catalyst for kind of aligned organizations to work together towards some shared purpose. And kind of I've been thinking about this for a little while. I'm working on a few active mergers at the moment, and it's they're good and they're positive, and sometimes they've come out of kind of a difficult situation. Sometimes they're very proactive, but the number of collaborations and mergers happening in a really, really crowded sector is really low. So I think your model is awesome from a distance. So what I want to do is learn a bit more about it, its genesis,
Of
how it
course.
operates, that sort of thing, and then maybe challenge philanthropists and governments in Australia to think about setting up something equivalent. That's kind of
That's
where.
incredible. That's incredible.
Cool.
Well, yeah, thrilled to share any insights that would be helpful to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Lindsay. Appreciate it. So tell me, to start off, tell me who Sea Change are and how Lodestar are and how those two entities came together, because the fund that you represent is a combination of those two entities, yeah?
Yeah, it is. It is among a few others. So, you're right that Lodestar is very key to this story. But Sea Change is a nonprofit that was founded back in 2007, with a intentionally broad mission to help other nonprofits that are exploring, or I'm sorry, that are facing complex organizational and financial opportunities and challenges. And so, what that has looked like in execution over the past, almost 20 years has been several, financial objects. So, we have and operate five lending funds for nonprofits in New
Okay.
York City, where we're headquartered. We operate five different grant funds that are available to help nonprofits exploring and planning what we broadly call sustained collaboration. So it's mergers, acquisitions, shared space or shared services, anything that is collaborative in nature and fundamentally shifts the business model of at least one of the participating entities. So
Okay.
that also this year, especially, I'm sure you've been seeing how beautifully functional and peaceful the United States is right now.
Okay, the whole world
Not
over, right? Yeah.
not so much. Yeah, of course, of course. And so the changes in governmental funding and policy have led to a lot more interest in this work and have allowed us to add formally wind down and dissolution to our purview in the grant funds.
Okay.
And so we are available to individual organizations that are looking to gracefully and planfully, transfer programs, transfer assets in the face of, a need to close or contract.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
then, yeah, and so those are our two major lines of business, the collaboration grant making, which goes hand in hand with referrals, advice for individual organizations, considering, these structures, and same on the lending side.
Okay.
Oftentimes, the actual grant or loan is one of the least helpful parts of the process. It's,
Okay.
hopefully we will have been able to connect you with qualified technical assistance and given you the space to brainstorm and all of that.
Okay.
And
So
load,
before we move into
yeah,
Lodestar,
please.
question. Access to capital, particularly through debt, is something that's really rare in Australia for nonprofits.
Oh,
Grant funding, of course, very, very common, but actually accessing loans and debt, very, very rare. I guess
yeah.
charities are often seen as not a secure investment. There are exceptions,
That's
please don't get me
similar
wrong, but
here too.
okay, okay, right. I
Yeah.
wonder if there's something fundamentally different. Yeah, grant making very, very common. Loans very, very rare.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything really fundamentally different. It's just different sources. So we call ourselves essentially a lender of last resort. We recommend that organizations go to some of the more conventional sources, their bank if they have an existing line of credit,
Uh-huh.
community development financial institutions, what we call CDFIs or CDCs. And so there are lots of other places where they can get the more secured loans and more secured access to capital, we usually end up taking the part that nobody else wants. So like
Okay.
first loss, bridge capital, no guarantees, unsecured. That tends to be our our realm. And if you are interested
Yeah.
in learning more about that, I would be glad to connect you with my colleague Taj Tabassum, who leads that side of our business.
Okay.
I lead the collaboration side, so my
Okay.
knowledge will be pretty limited.
That's
But
okay. No, I'm most
she's
interested
an
in your area.
expert.
Great.
And so then, yeah, so how we got involved with Lodestar, they have been involved in the field of nonprofit collaboration now for upwards of 25 years. And that's really notable because number one, for a long time, it was a very lonely game, and still
Okay.
is not a, particularly popular one. But that said, funders, and I'm sure you might be seeing similar behavior among the funding community in Australia. It funders like to go deep on something and then often pivot, right? Like, and sometimes it's here in the United States over the past 5 years, it's been trust-based philanthropy and then racial justice in the wake of some of our racial unrest in 2020. And then it was COVID relief. And
Okay.
now it's federal funding relief, right? And so it's really notable that Lodestar has stuck with this on the surface pretty unexciting, right? Like infrastructural type of investment for as long as they have, and they have not aberrated. They've stayed the course.
Okay.
And so we got involved with them pretty early in Sea Change's journey. Within the first couple of years, once the firm started, this long predates me, so I don't know all of the specifics, but they were approached by Lodestar. There are very few nonprofit intermediaries with a focus on finance here
Uh-huh.
at the
Yep.
time, and they reached out for a conversation, and it turned out to be a fit. And so they launched the Sea Change Lodestar Fund together in 2009. And then since then, their investment, Lodestar's investment in other local funds, has catalyzed the growth of an entire network of funds around the country that support this work. So,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, we hold five at Sea Change. The Sea Change Lodestar Fund is still functional, national in purview, and open to any organization where there isn't a local initiative on the ground.
Okay.
We run three of those local initiatives. So one serves New York City, one serves the city of Philadelphia, where I'm located, and then we launched our first statewide fund this year for the state of Delaware. And then one issue-based fund called the Transformational Partnerships Fund, which is our first sector or issue-specific fund focused on helping institutions of higher ed, so colleges and universities,
Interesting.
explore whether to merge.
Okay. Fantastic. So how many funders of capacity building, well, not, it's not capacity building, sustainability and collaboration and potential mergers do you think there are in the country?
Around I think we actually have that stat because and I don't know if you've seen the work of the Sustained Collaboration Network. I just dropped the link into the chat for
Okay.
you.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks.
but yeah, it is the national network of funds that supports this, and so you'll see if you go on there. There's a map, and you can check out the individual initiatives.
Awesome.
But it looks like at the time of last update, there are 11 or 12 funds around the country, and they were tracking 177 funders that all supported one of those initiatives. So that's in our member initiatives at the network. And it's a funny you'll see me like take off one hat and put on another because we
Yeah.
actually fiscally sponsor this network at Sea Change as well.
Okay.
And
Okay.
used to manage it. Thankfully, we now have a third party manager. But it's as I told you, it's a very small field when all is said and done.
Yeah.
The so 177 at the network level, and then there are some national funders that do invest in infrastructure and have been open to supporting collaboration. Usually some of the corporate, like Fidelity Charitable Trustees Initiative or the Packard or Gates Foundations,
Okay.
Hewlett. and a couple of other larger national names.
Yeah, awesome. Fantastic. Can we talk a bit about the mechanics of how either your fund or most funds work?
Sure.
How's the capital managed? How is the fund, how does the fund connect with potential partner organizations? How do you assess their readiness and their appetite? Yeah, talk me through yeah, that process, please.
Absolutely. So, um, we'll start with the underlying capital. Most of these funds that exist as of now are still geographically concentrated or, exist to serve a certain community. And so each of them do have different underlying funders that support the work. One of the smallest is probably going to be the Sea Change Lodestar Fund because it is two funders, us and Lodestar. And then we also have a couple of the largest funds. Our Philadelphia Fund, which is called the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund, has 16 funders that support it. So they all have different, and I'll just drop links as
Great,
they
thank you.
become, pertinent. So because they all serve slightly different areas or slightly different, sector or issue interest, they'll all be funded slightly differently by different partners.
And so
Um,
those funders that sit behind might be private individuals, might be corporate foundations, but that have an interest in that local geographic area, and they've chose to fund through they've chose to give through these funds as opposed to giving programmatic funding over here or institutional funding in isolation.
Precisely.
Okay.
And they do a lot. They all have their own portfolios as well. And usually their commitment to the local fund is going to be equivalent to what they would make in a single grant to a single organization.
Okay.
So these funds, in some ways, have to function strictly as intermediaries, right? Like to nonprofits approaching, we're seen as funders, but to the funders that underwrite the work, we're seen as a grantee.
Yeah.
Um, and
Interesting.
so, yes, I'd say that by far the heaviest skew is private foundations. Um, but then there is, I would say, second in terms of support levels nationally, will be corporate foundations, and then individual donors kind of coming in last there,
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
involved in these. The fund we helped launch in Massachusetts, we fiscally sponsor it, but we don't administer it. They are one of the newest. They just launched this year, and they have one of the most interesting funder mixes. They're about like 30 to 40% individuals, and the rest, private foundations. So it really runs the gamut in terms of where the wealth is concentrated in those
Excuse
regions
me.
and who, wants to get involved in an initiative.
Okay. So the just a reflection on as I go through this, I keep replay kind of comparing your experience back to Australia, which I think it's fair to say has a less evolved philanthropic sector and for-purpose sector for a whole heap of historical and cultural reasons. And but there has been for probably decades now a growing trend from programmatic funding, give money straight to as quickly to the beneficiaries as possibly through to capacity building. Um, I would imagine it is quite an informed donor, whether it be an individual or a foundation, corporate foundation, that wants to invest not just into capacity building for an organization, but into a fund that then enables capacity building for structural change. And has that been a difficult sell over the last, a couple of decades?
I mean, so it hasn't, so to reflect the question back, is it difficult to get folks to invest in these?
Yeah, yeah, that's the
Yeah.
question.
I mean, yeah, I think it is. It's not, it goes counter to the way that most foundations fund, right? So if you think about how the standard private foundation is organized, they're going to have these issue areas, arts and culture, health and human services, homelessness, whatever their issue is that
Yeah,
they're interested in. These funds are all by nature, with the exception of the higher ed fund, sector blind, size blind. So we've made grants to the opera and the orchestra to come together, and we've made grants to, hospitals to merge. And so they don't often, that's just not the way that grant making works in foundations when you have these folks deeply specialized in specific issue areas. I will say that one of the reasons that we do have folks fund in advance and send the money to a pool is because then we can move quickly. So I don't know what the pacing looks like for
Okay.
foundation giving in Australia, but it's very standard here, especially among the larger funders, to only have maybe 3 or 4 grant cycles per year. And to make decisions, they call on their board 3 or 4 times a year to come and make those decisions. And then they're often multi-year gifts because it's more efficient to do it that way. That does not jibe well with the pace that this work takes for standard nonprofits. So we like to raise the funding in advance so that then once we do get approached with a situation, we can turn around and fund it pretty quickly within a couple of usually weeks or months, as opposed to, needing a 6-month lead time to get something into the board book.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah, okay. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's talk about the oh yeah, the capital. So I assume that would you be do you invest the capital for a mix of capital protection, income to grow the fund? Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, by the legal kind of, and it's funny, I was just talking about this earlier today. Legally, all of these funds are not standalone entities. They're programs of either nonprofits, foundations, intermediaries, and so we do, at Sea Change, because we hold them and we hold so many different funds where the money is restricted. We do pool resources and invest and kind of track what projects were put into the investments and pull out as needed. But on the whole, it's really just the cash coming from directly from foundations, and these aren't sort of perpetual resources in the same
Okay.
way that an endowment would be.
Okay.
We re-raise the funding whenever it runs out. So we give it away and we raise it as well.
Right.
So
Interesting. Is that a conscious decision, or is that just where you've ended up? Because I mean, like any fund, right? An endowment model has its benefits.
let me tell you, if somebody wanted to endow any of our funds, we would certainly be thrilled. But it isn't, it just hasn't been something that anybody has wanted to
Okay.
endow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. And let's talk about the process of organizations connecting with the fund, how they're assessed, what their support looks like through a process. Are there gates? Are there stages at which money is given, incentives to complete a process? Talk me through that, please.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, the thing to remember, or the thing to know about these is that they all tend to be driven internally from the organizations. So we as funders, we as folks who are, spreading the word about this work, educating about this work, we are not out here to drive actual market activity. We do not. Like if the nonprofit sector is in the right format, and however many organizations there are now are the ones that are actually needed, and they're all viable and vital and all of that, that's great. But that isn't the case. Like
Yeah.
most of the nonprofit sector is underfunded, like overextended, and most organizations probably could do things more efficiently, effectively, or sustainably by partnering even on thinking about, sharing back office functions or
Yeah.
sharing staff.
Understood.
Um, and so uh, the way it generally works is organizations will reach out to us, and foundations, as I said, they give us the funding, and then for regranting, but also to cover our costs on administering the fund. And so the first piece of that is really just kind of working the phone. So it begins with a call in or an email in We will speak with any organization that is interested in learning about this work. So this is, very different to a foundation in that, like, if you try to cold call the program officer in arts and culture at the Pew Charitable Trusts, I don't think you will be hearing back. We are not just a funder, right? We are here to normalize this conversation and share what we know. And so we'll take a call with any organization interested, and based on where they are, we'll either give them some advice to continue moving forward in their process or in their considerations, or if they are ready for an application, then we would direct them to the appropriate fund and, invite them to apply.
Okay, yeah.
And in terms of, so, I would say on average in a year at Sea Change across our five funds, we are probably fielding somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 inquiries per year
Wow.
for these funds.
Okay.
So it's high volume. And then from there, if they have a partner identified, and our grants are tied to the third party and transactional costs associated with this work. So that's kind of another piece that when you talk about the gates, right? Anybody is ripe or and ready for the advice or for the conversation piece. But then when it comes to accessing the funding, there are a couple of things we need to see in place. Um, so let me back up. The very first tranche that we fund in is called seed funding. That is the only pool of funds that's available to individual organizations. So all of our other grant offerings are going to be available to pairs or multiple organizations. The seed grants are very small, and are designed to address a discrete readiness need on behalf of the organization. So, common costs that we've seen folks using a seed grant to fund are things like bringing in a merger expert or lawyer to walk through the various forms of how, like, the collaboration can look. And so that they as staff leadership and their boards are beginning the process with common understanding, common vocabulary. We've seen organizations use seed grants for space or facilities assessment if they're looking into a co-location agreement. We've seen I'd say the most common use we've seen this year, as many sources of funding that, were long-standing and pretty reliable were removed. Folks have been calling in for a seed grant to redo their financial modeling, redo their financial projections so that they can have an adequate understanding of what their runway is for figuring out, like, if we'd like to go and speak with partners, one of the first questions will be, how healthy are you financially? Do you have, a year of expenses? Do you have 3 months of expenses? Those types of questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, because they're for individual organizations and usually tied to one very discrete piece of work, they're small. So somewhere in the neighborhood usually of 2,500 to $10,000.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the seed. And then the really interesting work is the exploratory and implementation work. And those are the grants that are available to two or more nonprofits. So by the time you're coming for the first sort of formal pool of funding, you do need to have a partner organization identified. And the exploratory grants get organizations from having that partner all the way through the initial feasibility due diligence work to make a determination of whether or not they would like to move forward with planning and implementing the new structure. And so that usually the most common cost we're covering there is like a facilitator or a consultant to come in and, do the individual interviews with the groups
Yeah.
and the group work. And then the final product is usually, a report of the findings of the process, what was said, where some opportunities may be ripe for, formal collaboration, and some recommendations.
Yeah.
That's then given to the orgs to use with their boards to make that decision of whether or not to move forward.
Yeah.
And we notably see the decision not to move forward in partnership to be equally as valuable to the decision to move forward in
Oh,
partnership.
and what sort of ratio do stop there versus moving forward?
I would say it really is about 50-50.
Yeah,
I
interesting.
would say maybe a little higher, like 60-40, but people come with all different types of motivations. And so some things are much riskier from the start. Some things are coming from a place of proactivity or planning versus, crisis or financial concern. So,
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, so we see, that as really the sort of no risk or like we want the organizations to see it as an investment without risk, right? That we're really there to make sure that they have the capacity and the required assistance to go through this in a thoughtful way.
And what are the grant sizes through that exploratory implementation
Yeah,
phase?
so the outlier there is going to be on the higher ed front because um, those grants to the colleges and universities, just because of complexity with accreditors and the amount of, state funding and private funding and all of that, they're much higher. And so those grants cap out at $100,000. But then for all the other funds, a far more sort of average size would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to $30,000 for an exploration.
Okay, yeah, cool, great.
Right. So then if they do decide to move forward in partnership, there's a second tranche of funding available called implementation funding,
Hmm.
which helps them get from the point of having that decision made all the way through the legal enactment of whatever the new collaborative format is. So if it's shared space, we would call the legal close or the legal enactment the day that they're moving in. If it's a merger, it's when you're filing with the state attorney general or
Yeah,
the federal government to do the change in status. So each thing will be sort of dictated by the realities of the organization's situation. But this is where we see a lot more variation in the costs that we are funding
uh-huh.
because as you'll appreciate, it takes a lot of different work to enact something like a shared space agreement or a shared services agreement than it does to enact a full merger. So we'll almost always, because if it's a structural change, it's usually governed by some sort of agreement. We'll almost always see legal fees at the implementation phase,
Yep.
unless everybody has pro bono representation. We will see any element of integrating systems that's pertinent to the format they've chosen. So that could be, client or patient data,
Yeah.
bringing IT systems together, getting everyone on the same email and phone servers and HR systems and pay scales.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's the really, we joke it's the very unsexy but necessary work of coming together. It's really the plumbing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's necessary. And so we do see a lot of variation in the cost once again, just because we're looking at a lot of different formats at that point. But it's the brass tacks of bringing the organizations together.
Okay.
And
My
the
experience
average
has been
size on that skews a little bit higher just because there tends to be more to do at that phase.
mm,
So generally average somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to $50,000.
yeah. I've been through a couple and mergers over the last few years, and now advise on particularly those early stages, the boardroom conversations and the two CEOs into one discussions, and the tackling those other kind of early thorny questions that need to be addressed fairly early. And my experience is that there's as much time in the preliminary discussions as there is in the post-completion integration. Um, the costs associated with the integration are higher because changing CRMs and finance systems and all that kind of stuff just costs a lot of money.
It
But
sure does.
the time involved probably is the same in preparatory work as it is in the post enactment implementation. And if you see the same thing in for American cases.
We do on the whole. I'd say that, based on why folks it's two major buckets, right? If you're coming at it from a place of planning and proactivity, or if you're coming at it from a place of reactivity to a change in status that essentially is introducing an existential threat for the organization.
Yeah, yeah,
And we see both and we're comfortable with both.
yeah,
And I think kudos to the funders because it is another moment of being against their nature of seeing essentially a house on fire and rather than just putting it out, running in to see like what we should save.
yeah.
So it's I do applaud their kind of openness in that way.
Uh-huh.
That said, um, we keep in touch. I'd say the average time to explore a transaction we see taking somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 months for organizations. Um, Sometimes a little bit longer, like 9 months to a year, but usually no shorter than I'd say 3 months. And once again, it could be because of the circumstances are different. It could be that the organizations knew each other or already collaborated on programming, so they have a little bit more of that understanding and trust, between parties. And then integration it definitely is a long tail. So we stay in touch with our grantees for the implementation phase for 2 years post the legal close or the legal enactment. And by then, I'd say it's done, and they're starting to realize some of the impact outcomes that they were striving for from the onset in most cases, right? Like
Okay.
it really depends, and it depends how large and entrenched the culture was and all of that. But 2 years is usually enough of a window for us to learn what really changed as a result of them coming together. I would
Yeah.
not say that to be true at the 1 year mark. There's still usually in the tangible pieces of coming together at that point, right? Like creating
Yeah.
that shared culture, making sure group norms are flowing well and all that.
Awesome. In a minute, I'm going to ask a bit more about how you measure success. What does success look like, and what the results have been?
Mhm.
Just going to make a note here.
Sure.
Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, let's get into that. So obviously the funders are giving not just because they believe in the organizations in the local area or the sector, but because they believe that their investment's going to create more effective for purpose, social purpose entities. How do you measure then the success of the fund and each project? Yeah, full stop. Answer that first, please.
Right. So the success of the fund is really going to be dictated by the success of the transactions. We as a fund want to make sure that, once again, the goals of the fund are things like educate the ecosystem, right? Normalize the conversation. Lots of these intangible pieces that we broadly measure by things like how often is the phone ringing? If we're getting the same number of calls in 2025 as we got in 2015, I don't think we could say in good faith that we had done much to normalize the conversation. But we get about 3 times more calls in 2025 than we got in
But
2015. And
the
so
ecosystem's changed, right?
ecosystems change
Yeah.
too. This isn't a single year thing to measure either. I mean, we've been slowly growing the number of calls and the number of engagements we're taking in any given year um, pretty steadily through these funds, with the exception of some of the COVID years where folks kind of, for lack of a better term, hibernated. And,
Mm. Yeah.
there was a lot of relief funding available from government and from private philanthropy. And so we didn't actually get a lot of calls in 2020 and 2021 because it was difficult to plan for the following week, let alone the following year.
But
Um,
if phone ringing is one of your measures of success, if you if you have if the funds have helped create a more effective for purpose sector and organizations are working more efficiently, the phones would ring less. But if you haven't, if the conversation around collaborations and hasn't normalized, the phone would ring less. So I don't know. It doesn't feel like the right sort of measure of change. But I guess
right. And
it's
that's why I
something that
say,
can
like,
be
I
measured.
mean, measuring the effectiveness of the funds is not something that has happened much, right? And this is something that anecdotally, funders are looking for certain things, and it's going to be different from fund to fund as well.
So one of the so I'm thinking through how one of these could be set up if the right informed funding partners were aligned. There feels like there would be two better metrics. The first would be some measure of efficiency within organizations. So, overhead ratios. If you've got two organizations with a
But
20%
that's
overhead
at
ratio,
the
then smash.
transactional level. That's at the
Okay.
transactions level.
Okay. So you're talking about
The
um,
fund overall, right? Because that's what I say. The majority of the success metrics or the success measures for the fund are going to come down to the success measures of the transactions
okay.
that the
Okay.
fund is funding, right? I think it's important for us to take the educational mandate and the making sure we're an accessible resource piece seriously. But when it comes down to how to actually, what the funders care about the most, it comes down to specific organizational
Okay.
outcomes. And we can only go by, what the organizations are reporting there.
Yeah.
Um, and so in terms of let's spend some time there then on how we measure the success of the individual transactions. Um, First and foremost, the organizations set their success metrics.
Okay.
And that is because, once again, only they will know, or they will certainly know best, what it is they were setting out to solve for by coming to this to begin with. So I'd say the three major motivators for organizations coming to the table to explore or plan these transactions are broadly grouped into financial. So that's either to increase their own financial stability by diversifying revenue or entering a more stable organization's backbone. It could be by building capacity to be able to have in-house fundraising support that they didn't have before. It could be by growing into a new program or service area and hence being at a larger size so that they can more effectively compete for certain types of funding, like
Uh-huh.
particularly in that case, like government contracts tend to really privilege the large organizations. And so if you're below $25 million budget, you may not even be eligible to apply for these types of state or federal
Yeah.
funds.
Yeah.
So financial is one. Um, Programmatic is the second broad like motivator. And so we generally say that that's to grow, enhance, or preserve programs. And so grow and enhance tend to be the more proactive, planning types of transactions, where it's like, we would love to, uh, you know, we have a great proven model here in Philadelphia that we'd like to also take to southern New Jersey across the river. Is there a community partner there we can work with to expand this or enhance, I lead a child care center for preschool age and you lead one for infants. Is there a way that we can centralize intake and share staff and make it a more efficient and seamless process for
Yeah.
families enrolling? Um, but what we're seeing more of in times of distress like this is preserving programs. Program X is no longer viable at this organization. Is there another organization that is better positioned to ensure that, it can survive and that the ultimate, community services aren't interrupted for
Uh-huh.
the ultimate beneficiaries, their community.
Yeah.
And then lastly, we see organizations coming to the table to um, address a specific piece of their infrastructure that may need, a different model. So that's where we see a lot of the shared back office, shared staffing types of transactions where it's, we know that we could do this work better if we were able to access this system. We cannot afford it on our own. Is there a way that we can partner with someone else to share technology cost?
Yeah.
Um,
Great.
and so those are the three motivations. And so the metrics for any transaction will likely end up rolling into one of those categories, right? Like reduce administrative overhead spend and reinvest into program by 25% by the end of year two.
Hmm.
Um, grow our services from, being able to serve 100 people across these combined sites to 150 by the end of year two. And
Hmm.
so those types of things tend to be the most key pieces that we pay attention to. But then on top of that, I mean, and it's far more rare because you're not going to see this in every single transaction because you're not going to have organizations that repeat, or we just don't have a critical mass of organizations that have come for repeat engagements. So acquiring and then acquiring again. But
Mm.
for the ones that have, and we hope that, another 10 years from now, we have enough of a body of work here that it can be, evaluated and researched. We have seen the actual capacity being built internally in these organizations to go through a phase of this themselves. So, to use an example here in Philadelphia, we made a grant in 2017 to a men's shelter to merge with another shelter. We funded in both phases, exploratory and implementation. Fast forward 8 years to this January, the same men's shelter approached for another acquisition. This time, they only needed implementation funding because they learned from the exploratory process the first time that we paid for how to do the exploratory diligence themselves in a way that was satisfactory to their board.
Yeah. Okay.
So those types of things we get really excited when we hear. But once again, it's so rare and so anecdotal at this point that we just don't have, a critical mass to evaluate on those things.
Interesting. Okay. Um, Great. I have a couple more questions, and you very again, thank you so much for being generous with your time this afternoon.
Of course.
Um, if you're getting 300 inquiries a year, I would assume you can't even start the exploratory phase with 300 potential beneficiaries or partner organizations. How do you assess those that are serious versus just making an inquiry, those who are just looking for a bit of cash to bail them out of a crisis situation, versus those that have given some thought? This is a genuine strategy, either a strategy for either survival or scale or
Hmm.
whatever else it might be. Tell me about that assessment process, please.
Like, I think in terms of the getting a little cash standpoint, right? Because the grants, and that's a really good observation because that is one of the reasons that we tie these grants to third party costs. So none of the grant money is sticking to the organization. It's restricted funds to be used for the third party technical assistance that they need to pre-identify as part of the application
Okay.
process.
So
So
does that look like you cut a check to consultant A or lawyer B?
no, we cut the check to the organization, but the grant letter, states that it's a restricted grant
Okay.
to be used only for the purposes of X. Um, and so, yeah, I mean that alone is one indicator, but that to say, there's a whole swath of organizations that would never reach us that have done fantastically effective mergers, and that the big demarcation there is that they might have internal capacity to do it on their own. If you think about larger organizations that have general counsel on staff, that have, capacity in the house and have maybe grown to a certain size due to acquisitions or mergers. If they don't need to bring in third party technical assistance, then they're not going to work with us because that's the only thing we can fund. And so there would be no role. So
Okay. Yeah.
just to call that out as a limitation of our model. Um, but yeah, so one indicator of the seriousness is did you go out and talk to a consultant and get a scope of work and do all that work to apply for us? Additionally, our diligence process is very conversational, and so that gives us a really good glimpse into what's actually going on under the hood at the organization. We do have an online application that they fill out, including a couple of years of financials and current year budget and, information about the organization that you would see on probably any standard private foundation
Yeah.
application. And then we also ask about the mechanics of the potential deal of, why they're coming to this now, what were their motivations, what do they hope to gain from coming together, what are the risks, and then what's their timeline. And then from there, we have our the sort of non-negotiable parts of our diligence process will include a review of all of those materials, um, conversation with joint staff leadership. So we need both EDs on the phone together talking about what it is they're trying to do. The fact that it's a joint application to begin with is another thing that kind of demarcates those who are serious from those who are not. And then lastly, we do speak with a board member from each of the participating organizations. So this can't even be something that has stopped socialization at the staff level. They
Uh-huh.
need to have talked about it with their board in
Yeah.
order to then apply for our funding.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I like that idea of having both CEOs or EDs on the because any
Mhm.
joint application for the exploratory implementation phase needs both
Yes, the
organizations
only
being
thing
completely
that's a
transparent and
solo app is seed. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But they don't seem, I haven't heard any hard criteria around size, for example, or
So no size, no sectoral criteria. The only two criteria to enter the exploratory process is you have a partner identified and you have some third-party costs identified. And then we, through the diligence conversations and materials review, get to whether or not it feels like a strong proposal to fund or not.
yeah,
And then for implementation, we do need to, because, as linear as it sounds, folks find us at all different points, right? So they may have already explored or they may not need to explore. And then they Google, merger funding and find sea change. So we can't retroactively fund them for that exploratory process.
yeah.
But implementation funding, we need a board resolution signed that they are planning to move forward in this process as
Okay,
part of those diligence materials as well.
yeah, makes sense. Brilliant. Okay, if you were starting the fund from scratch, what would you do differently?
That's such a good question. And I think, right, like we're in the process where we did just start a fund from scratch this year.
Mhm.
So I will say, like, the most recent fund tends to be the strongest, always, in terms of its processes, because it always has the benefit of learning from funds before it, and the pitfalls and the things we, learned from launching New York 15 years ago and Philly 10 years ago and all. I'll say that some of the things that are most key in terms of the refinements we have made over the years as we've launched more and more of these. Number one, common reporting to funders, right? Like I have 16 funders that support the Philadelphia Fund. If I, as a half, theoretically, I spend half of my time on the Philadelphia Fund and the other half on the four others. But we're a really lean place. Sea Change, I'm one of eight on the whole firm is eight people. The grant making team is two and a half. And so we're all busy. We're all doing work on several different funds at once. And if we had to do 16 different reports to 16 different foundations every year on this work,
Uh-huh.
and another six for the New York Fund, and another four for the higher ed, and it would tank you right there. Like
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can't
yeah,
you
yeah,
can't be doing all of that and also be doing what we feel to be the more important work of being by the phone and ready to work with the nonprofits that are inbound. So I think the first and foremost, right, is common reporting, but more so than that, that rolls up to a more foundational core tenet of these are nonprofits first, nonprofit centric. If it comes down to a nonprofit is calling and they are, in crisis mode and they're going to be closing by the end of this week. And I also have, so they need a rush situation and we need to like get involved. Um, and I also have a grant report due to a funder that week. The funder is the one that's going to be getting the call of saying, I'm going to need a little bit of leeway here. We need to get involved in this situation. So I think, yeah, it is interesting in this intermediate space where, we work with funders, we work with nonprofits, but nonprofit centric has been our approach, and I think that's worked well over the years. Um,
You can you ask a philosophical you raise a philosophical question. So if you get the emergency
Please.
situations when organization X is 2 months from insolvency because the
Mhm.
world's changed, funding's been pulled, whatever else it might be, it suggests to me it would suggest some level of mismanagement. They've mismanaged their risk, they haven't anticipated changes in the environment.
Mhm.
Does that not present a red flag for an
It does.
organization that is turning to you for funding? A bail No funder likes to give money to bail organizations out, right?
Right.
How do you manage that?
With the funders or with the organization or
Well,
both?
how does it inform your assessment process? Like you've talked about the two mainstreams, right? There is the proactive, strategic, intentional merger
Mhm.
to achieve greater scale. Beautiful. Like that's where we should all be operating in. But the reality
Right,
is there'll be
of
a lot of
course.
organizations going, crikey, we can't carry on our own. Let's find an alternative. Um, that latter group, you could assume that latter group has some failure in its governance or its management that's allowed them to get into this situation.
I'd say yes and
Why would you make
no.
a bet on them?
I'd say yes and no, right? Like, first of all, yes and no. Because if one thing that is one thing that this year and the COVID years laid bare for us in this work, there can be organizational leaders that are truly taking their duties seriously and doing everything on paper right. And when the National Endowment for the Arts pulled all of its existing grant requirements and funding and any new pending funding, there were organizations left with 80% of their budget suddenly uncovered.
Yeah, yeah, true. I guess in that context, it makes sense, right? You can have some amazing
Right.
leaders,
And
amazing
that has
organizations,
been
and social impact, but environment
precisely
changes. Yeah.
because, a lot of these organizations, and I do think, right, like we do privilege when we're thinking about their sustainability in the long term. We're thrilled when we see organizations with diversified funding stream. Like the same things that get programmatic funders excited about betting on a specific arts and culture org or a specific education org. We get excited about those things too. We love to see, oh my gosh, well, I spoke yesterday with an organization that provides support services for survivors of domestic violence. And their staff costs and their overhead costs are 95% funded by state, city, and federal contracts. So if
Hmm.
any of those divisions decide to pull some money, they could be up a creek. What have they done? They actually started a thrift shop, right? Where they take donations and they have this other stream of revenue. They made over $1.5 million on the thrift shop this year, right? So we get excited when we see like better situations, and but part of the work, part of the ethos is that this is something that should be available to all organizations, whether or not they come from a place of strength or weakness.
Okay.
Um, yeah, we do have to take it into account, right? And when there is weakness or when we're dealing with some of these restructuring, wind down, dissolution situations, we are getting a little bit more involved in asking, okay, like the board, because things happen, right? Like we're a nonprofit too. Like we haven't thankfully had our name in the New York Times on fraud and hope we never do, but like, we get it. And so okay, you got into this pickle. Like, what changes have been made? How has the board been acting to plan for how we go from here? Is it the same board that got you into this situation in the first place? If so, then that's probably not something we'll ultimately recommend funding.
Yeah.
Or if anything, we would recommend funding the very discrete costs of like a receiving organization to take on those programs and get them out of a mismanaged,
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah. Great. Brilliant. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I didn't have any other questions. This has been so good.
I'm
Um,
so glad.
yeah, I hope to use this to challenge government and philanthropic leaders here to go. There is absolutely a need for the equivalent structures in Australia, whether it be geographic based, whether it be national, because there isn't much conversation about this at the moment. And
Yeah.
I certainly see this, when there are organizations that can see alignment, um, there's three things that get in the way. One is ego and self-interest and all the human foibles that we address on a daily basis. The second is a resource, money and time. And if you don't have, if you are scrambling around for every last cent in order to keep the operation running and keep people employed, the idea of investing in consultants and lawyers to go through a complex process like this is just it's out of reach. And I think this could have a real role in at least changing that part of the conversation. And then there are other things you can use to address the human complexities as well here. But I think there's a real place for this. So thanks.
I'm so glad. I hope this was helpful. And if, Alex, if a second conversation would be useful, or if you'd like a connection to the director of the network, or, I would recommend, if you are interested in continuing to gain the momentum, A, we would be happy to have another conversation at any time. But B, Lois Savage, who is the president of the Lodestar Foundation, I would be thrilled to introduce you to her if you would be interested, because she has really seen it for such a long time and the way it has changed, and has such a clear vision of why she stays involved in funding this work, that if you're looking for additional info, she'd be a great additional conversation.
Awesome. All right.
So just
I'll
let us
consider that.
know
Thank you.
how
Yeah.
we may be helpful.
Okay, Lindsay, again, thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely weekend. I'm going to go and start not start my day, and I start part two of my day.
Start your Saturday. I
Yeah.
love it. Well, from Friday, from the past, have a wonderful one, and have a, happy holidays and happy new year as well.
You too. Okay, all the best. Take care. Bye bye.